I had a great job. I worked for 12 years at Goldman. Why would you leave such a well-paying job? The reality is that the corporate world was super slow versus what I have now. When you're running a household, you lose all structure. It is so much harder and so much more nuanced and a totally switched on job to run a household. And it's Monday to Sunday. People need to change that narrative. It is not a mother's job to raise kids because both are parents. I think the journey from stay-at-home dad to a homemaker now is probably says my promotion over the last month.
Did you have a number in mind when you decided that, okay, I'll quit?
We had that 5 number and I had significantly crossed that. But then we realized, what do you really need to survive in a good lifestyle? If a risk-free interest from your savings can give your cost of living, that should be your number.
Hi, Pranshu. Welcome to Power Up. Let's deep dive right away into your LinkedIn title, which intrigued all of us, which is being stay-at-home dad. So, do you think Indian society is accepting of stay-at-home dads? What's been your journey with that?
In terms of the Indian society being ready, I feel like everybody loves the idea of being a stay-at-home dad, but they're not ready to really accept what that sort of entails, right? And that continues, right? So like when my son was at preschool and I was picking him up in the afternoon, right? There would be a neighbor sort of lady in the park when I was walking home. She'd ask, oh, how come you're free during the day to pick him up? I'm like, well, I work from home is what I just tell people, right? So they want to know huge specifics in terms of how do you make this work or why does this even work, right? And same thing, like there are so many mothers picking up kids, right? There will be 10 mothers picking up their kids and one sort of dad in me. And nobody questions the mothers.
And in your journey, like how did your family respond to when you decided to be a stay-at-home dad?
Everybody initially just gets shocked a bit, right? Or sort of wonders why, right? Because I had a great job. I worked for 12 years at Goldman. I had a great career trajectory. It was going up as well. And both me and my wife were doing well. So when we talked about this and had this conversation of just wanting to leave at 6 years, right? It was like, why would you leave such a well-paying job and do this, right? Because it's just not normal. But I think when we spoke to them about why we are doing this, I think it made sense to the immediate family. And that's all that mattered, right? So me and my wife being sort of on board with this and everybody else around us, including mostly our parents, right? If they were fine, then I think everything was fine because it made sense to us. It was right in terms of how we were anchoring our lives and we just sort of went ahead with it.
Pranshu, now that you're at home, how does your day look like and how has it changed from your fast-paced corporate world?
Right. I think the reality is that the corporate world was super slow versus what I have now. Because, then there was a very defined sort of task to my days, going to office essentially and coming back, right? When you're running a household, you lose all structure, especially with kids, right? So now my day starts much earlier. I wake up at 6, try to put together my son's breakfast, send him off to school, right? Then sort of my little one, she's 2 years old. The moment she's up, you've got to be basically just hands-on with her all the time. So I take her to an accompanied class, which is just by definition for every school called a mother-toddler class.
Okay.
So I'm the only dad at like 5 different mother-toddler classes, to the extent that I've had some schools now naturally just change to parent-toddler because they've seen me come in. And so I think that is the real change and the real win for me, is that people need to change that narrative. It is not a mother's job to raise kids because both are parents, right? So until like 10, I essentially just spend time with kids and wherever my wife and I can sort of sneak in a moment of peace, right? It is so much harder and so much more nuanced and a totally switched on job to run a household. And it's Monday to Sunday. Like Sunday to Monday.
There are no off.
So it literally goes on throughout versus in office, okay, there's always a weekend and the assumption that, okay, now you're back from work, so you must be tired, so you get rest. And so me making that journey from just a dad and my wife still taking all the mental load of, planning meals, this and that, to being able to participate in that, being able to cook now. I think the journey from stay-at-home dad to a homemaker now is what I've probably say is my promotion over the last 1 year.
So that's so nice. I think this is something that's been happening, right? We grew up seeing our moms like this, but it was never talked about because it was taken for granted. So I think we need discussions like these. We need people like you to take these steps and have these conversations that's also a full-time job.
Absolutely.
Why did you decide to quit your corporate job and do nothing?
Right.
For that.
So in terms of sort of background, right? I have a 6-year-old son and a 2-year-old daughter, and our son was born in 2018, and soon after, sort of in 2020, we were hit with COVID, right? And we were in Hong Kong, which is sort of the epicenter in terms of the highest restrictions. We literally done 3-week quarantines in hotels, right, over there, and so it was quite crazy that way. But that also allowed us time with him at home. which told us how precious that is, right? For him to have us around. And so when we were sort of thinking of a second child at one point, right? My wife sort of just brought up the fact that when we have her, or him, right, a second child, we would ideally want a parent to be at home. So Feb 2023 is when our daughter was born, and July is when I sort of resumed work. And soon after, I told my boss, right, that I want to spend time with kids and I want to just sort of not work alongside it. I could have kept the job and tried to do that, but again, you can't be a present parent while you're also sort of working.
That's nice. And how did your lifestyle change? So from a very hectic corporate job to now this lifestyle, what's been like the key change for you?
I think the biggest one is identity, right? And I tell this to people a lot. Most of the times when we introduce ourselves, we go with our names and then what we do. And that significantly changes. A huge part of your identity is sort of taken away. And so you've got to be very comfortable in who you are and your personal identity and not related to something, right? That's why I think when you make a switch like this, you've got to be very content and confident in yourself in relating yourself to actually what you're doing, right? And so I think the lifestyle change wasn't as significant just because we were never extravagant people in terms of how we lived, right? Even though we'd sort of grown very significantly in our careers over time, it was very similar in terms of, a simple lifestyle that we had. But I think the identity part was the biggest change in terms of when people ask me, what do you do?
Would love to understand your financial planning towards early retirement, and considering your wife is also working. So did you have a number in mind when you decided that, okay, I'll quit? Or was it like more on the go move?
We had that 5 number and I had significantly crossed that, right? And so that was one sort of number that we wanted to go with. Beyond that, you could keep adding to it, but then we felt like, what do you really need to survive in a good lifestyle, right? And that should be your interest, sort of purely risk-free interest income. So let's assume a family needs 2 lakhs to survive in wherever they're living, right? Whether it's rental included, not included, depending on their state, right? 2 lakh becomes 24 lakhs in a year. And on the current state, like if that's 2 people earning that money, that's almost tax-free, right? So you get 24 lakhs. And for that to be like a 5% interest-free post-tax income, so that translates into what, a 4.8 crore corpus, right? What I tell myself is if a risk-free interest from your savings can give your sort of cost of living, that should be our number. And that would be different for everyone, but that's the math that we did. And we sort of added a cushion, so we had that. But again, the fact that my wife continued to work, that income, obviously that makes sure that we don't even need to touch our corpus, right?
So basically you didn't, or rather, the wife's salary is more like an extra cushion.
Correct.
But you made sure that even the corpus that you had was enough to take care of the family for the rest. So what was the salary when you started Goldman and when you moved to Hong Kong and when you exited?
When I started back in 2012, I graduated from XLRI, I interned and I got an offer. My starting salary was 13 lakhs per annum. I started in India itself, right? And that was the base. And so obviously there's a bonus component. You'd end up with 16, 17 a year. I think that comp had grown to about, say, between 30 to 40 while I was still here in 2017. I think the major shift happens when you move abroad just because of the currency change. And if you're still thinking of your savings in INR, that significantly goes up. And I was still an associate when I moved, and your range for a typical associate would be between 100 to 150K. Again, I grew there. In a couple of years, I made VP, was 5 years into sort of being a VP when I quit, right? And so a typical VP at Goldman would, in the area that I was, would earn anywhere between sort of 200 to 400K range, right? And so that's a significant jump from what I was here. And you translate that into INR and with the currency appreciation and all of that.
One thing I think our audience can also relate to more, if you can tell us how your salary also increased over the years to get a perspective on how fast the growth can be in such a career journey.
Sure. I think the important part, and again, I belong to a school which is very different from the school of thought that people come from today, right? I literally interned at Goldman and retired from Goldman. And so that's the only place I worked at, right? What I saw was, I think it's easy to get restless and quit for that next small jump, right? Because you get a 30% hike from someone else, you just move there. And then you get a 20% hike, you move elsewhere. And you slowly build these 20% hikes, but you miss out on that journey of building equity. What I did was, I probably had a slowish start, but I was sort of steady, right? The steady growth in Bangalore was probably 10, 12% per year, right? That happened. But then obviously when Hong Kong happened, it was a change into a US dollar salary, right? A lot of people that in corporate careers move abroad, they feel like their goal is done by moving abroad, right? But they don't continue to grow there. What happened with me was, luckily I was an equally good and strong performer when I was in Hong Kong as I was in India, which meant that my growth within Hong Kong was very steep. Like every year I was growing about 20 to 30% in terms of my comp, right? And over 6 years, that means you've close to double, tripled your income. And that significantly helps because, and your spend is not going that high, right?
Right.
I could only spend so much. Like when I had X salary and if I had 2X, 3X, my spend was still 0.5, 0.6X, right? And so that meant that my saving power significantly increased. I got the opportunity to move abroad. I did well there and I was rewarded further with, growth continuously, both in terms of levels as well as compensation. And I think where I ended up from like the start to the end was probably a 10x multiple or even higher. Whereas for most people, it can't be that. When I started in XLRI, my roommate was like, oh, you're very good at these cats and all. Why don't you give it again and go to IMA? I was like, I'm at the number 4 B school. Why would I waste a year and go to number 1? He's like, no, the companies that come there are very different. So you're relying on the external factors to build your brand. I never did that. I was like, I'll take what I have. I'll grow within that. So I trusted my abilities and luckily it worked out for me and I ended up where I did.
Yeah, your compounding in career really happened.
Exactly.
Got it. So, 2 questions here, right? One, what's your portfolio like and how is it split across different asset classes? What's your investment strategy been? Because you retired in 10, 12 years,
correct,
right? So what's your strategy been like?
When I was in India working in Bangalore itself, it was largely sitting in sort of FDs and some part sort of in SIPs. When I moved abroad, it was even more complex because I had those NRE, NRO accounts where I could only do certain things and couldn't do much. I'd send all my money back, but it was literally sitting in FDs. So I was getting like 5% on all of my corpus. Now is what I'm trying to do is change that, right? So my allocation, and this is more of an allocation goal because I haven't had the chance to sort of move all my money from X to Y over the last 1.5 years, but that's where I'm moving towards. What I want to do is keep about 50% of it still safe, right? FD/debt funds. The rest 50 I am fairly aggressive with in the sense that about 20% of it goes to private investments, which is angel investing, which is super risky and I could lose all of it, right? 20% goes in direct equities where I actually do stock picking because again, I have the experience, which I think I can hopefully, beat the markets with and just the understanding that I've built over the period. So 20% of it is direct equities and about 10% is in mutual funds, which is again, passive equities, but still equities. So about 50% high risk assets and 50% relatively still safe assets.
Got it. And in your journey, right, how much were you investing back then? How has that changed? Like, how did you maintain that discipline to invest all throughout?
So I think the good part about sort of a discipline in general is that we were never high spenders. So we naturally ended up saving a lot of what we earned. And I think a huge factor there is if you've got a double income family, right? You compound very quickly and I'll tell you how, right? So let's assume I've got a salary of X. Let's assume I spend 0.7 of mine, right? I save 0.3X. Now add to that a spouse who's equally sort of cost efficient and you still have the similar lifestyle. You don't really increase or spend so much. That 0.7 probably goes to 0.8, right? In terms of the overall spend. But you add an X to it, right? So now saving 0.3X to saving 1.2X suddenly, right? You've 4X to your savings.
Yeah.
And so the double income fact, and which is true for a lot of urban couples these days, is both of them are earning, right? And so if you've got financial prudence, you end up using your partnership as a huge, fillip to your financial independence. Because if you think of finances, together, then you've suddenly 4x your saving capacity. And then you invest that in however you sort of think, right? You could choose to split between risky assets for one and low risk assets for another, just so one is the cushion, one is the aggressive growth opportunity and so on.
Got it. And I think final note, what would be your advice to someone who is looking out to do this, take this decision of early retirement? What's your advice to him?
I think cutting out the external noise is a huge bit, right? You've got to sit down with the most significant stakeholders in the decision, which is mostly your spouse as well as your parents, perhaps. Decide what's best for you and then stick to it. Because the more external advice you seek and you get, it's likely going to deviate from what you're trying to do. And so you've got to define your priorities and just be very confident in them. And also know that it will evolve, right? We have that discussion every day almost, right? Did we do the right thing? Should we move back? Should we go to Singapore? Should we try this, try that, right? That's a constant discussion. But I think till now we've come back to the fact that no, this is the best decision we've made and we stick to it. Maybe it will evolve. Maybe in 2 years I'll be doing something else. But for now it feels right. And the conviction that we've had throughout has helped us sort of go through it and keep at it.
Wow. I think that's perfect note to end this podcast, Pranshu. I think your clarity of thought is so amazing. And personally, this is so close to my heart. Having this conversation, I think it will be a big win if I can get myself or a woman who has done through the same path, but she also deserves to talk about that because she chose to be a stay-at-home mom. So I think that's perfect. And thank you so much for sharing, your journey and your story. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nava. Thank you for having me.